In a mansion where silence was law and hope was exiled, two deaf boys lived behind invisible walls. Cairo and Ethan, twins born the night their mother's heartbeat stopped, existed in a world their billionaire father could not enter. Alaric Vaughn had tried everything: specialists, experimental therapies, foreign hospitals. Nothing reached them until Nariah Bassi, a maid with no credentials but unshakable faith, stepped into their lives. One afternoon in the kitchen, something impossible began to unfold. One song, one prayer whispered in motion, one moment that would shatter years of carefully guarded grief. But when Alaric walked in unaware and froze at what he saw, everything he believed about healing, about God, about his sons would be torn open. Stay with us, because what happened next rewrote everything they believed about healing. Nariah had been in the Vaughn mansion for just under 3 weeks, long enough to feel the weight of its silence pressing against her chest like a physical thing. The house was immaculate, every surface gleaming, every corner sterile. It smelled of expensive wood polish and emptiness. The boys rarely came near her at first, choosing instead to sit cross-legged on the floor of the sunroom, staring at picture books they couldn't hear, narrated, or wandering the marble hallways with their small hands trailing along the walls as if searching for something they'd lost. Alaric himself was a ghost in his own home, moving between his private office and the upstairs wing like a man performing the motions of fatherhood without ever truly arriving. His words, when he spoke at all, were clipped and transactional. He never raised his voice. He never lingered. He never looked his sons in the eyes for longer than necessary, as though afraid of what he might see reflected back. That morning had been no different. Breakfast was silent. The twins ate mechanically, their gazes distant. Alaric reviewed reports on his tablet, his jaw tight, his presence cold. Nariah had watched from the kitchen doorway, her heart aching with a strange, holy frustration. She had grown up in a household where noise was love, where her grandmother sang hymns while frying fish, where her siblings argued loudly over board games, where even grief was expressed through wailing and testimonies shouted toward heaven. The Vaughn mansion, by contrast, felt like a tomb, beautiful, expensive, dead. But Nariah had not come here by accident. She believed that. She believed God had placed her in this house for a reason, even if she didn't yet understand what it was. That afternoon, as she stood in the kitchen preparing lunch, she watched Cairo and Ethan sit at the small breakfast nook, their eyes lowered, their hands folded in their laps like miniature mourners. Something inside her shifted. Not a decision, exactly, more like a prompting, a nudge she had learned long ago not to ignore. Without overthinking it, she reached into her bag and pulled out the small Bluetooth speaker she carried everywhere, a gift from her church youth group years ago. She pressed play, letting the opening notes of a worship song fill the room. Not loudly, just enough to breathe life into the air. The melody was warm, layered with drums and clapping, full of soul and spirit. She expected nothing, maybe even resistance, but instead something shifted. Cairo looked up first, his brows furrowing, his lips parting as if forming a silent question. Ethan, sitting beside him, tilted his head like a bird hearing something distant. Then his foot began to tap. Slowly, hesitantly, but unmistakably in rhythm. Nariah's breath caught. Her heart thudded hard against her ribs. She didn't stop. She couldn't. Some ancient instinct told her to lean into this moment, to follow where the spirit was leading. She placed the speaker on the counter and began to sway her hips in time with the beat, exaggerating her movements just slightly, letting her arms rise and fall like waves. "Come on, little kings," she said softly, though she knew they couldn't hear her words in the way she intended. But she believed they could feel her. She believed God could translate what her voice could not. She moved closer to them, her feet light on the tile, her smile wide and inviting. She spun once in a slow circle, her colorful head wrap catching the light. Cairo tilted his head further, then rocked his torso forward and back, testing the motion. Ethan slapped his small hands on the tabletop, then slid off his chair, wobbling on unsteady legs, his eyes wide with something Naraya hadn't seen before. Joy! She gasped, but covered it with a laugh, clapping her hands once to encourage him. That's it, sweetheart. Yes, just like that. She twirled again, letting her body lead, letting the rhythm speak. And when she glanced back, she caught Cairo sliding down from his seat too, determined not to be left behind. Their movements were awkward, uncoordinated, and so far from graceful. But it didn't matter, because they were moving. They were reacting. They were alive in a way she hadn't seen since the day she arrived. She knelt slightly, dancing on their level now, encouraging their steps with her hands, her face, her entire being. Cairo's giggles, silent but visible in the shake of his shoulders, bounced off Ethan's shy but eager attempts to copy her. Ethan stomped his little feet, and his laughter, thin, high-pitched, but real, sent a sharp ache through Naraya's chest. She found herself smiling so hard her cheeks hurt. The more she moved, the more they responded. She decided to test the bond forming in those fragile moments. She bent low, picked up Ethan's small hands and guided them side to side like a dance partner. He resisted for a second, his body stiff with unfamiliarity, then relaxed, looking up at her with wide eyes that almost glowed with trust. Cairo tugged at her skirt, impatient not to be left out. So she freed one hand and took his as well, swaying with both boys as though they were a trio on a stage only they could see. See, we're dancing. You feel it, don't you? She whispered, though she knew words were not what carried the meaning. Her expression, her touch, her spirit did. The boys laughed again, clear, unguarded, contagious. Cairo tried to spin in a clumsy circle, almost falling, but Naraya steadied him, lifting him back upright with gentle hands. You're all right, baby. Try again. She exaggerated a spin herself, and this time both boys clapped, a sharp, imperfect rhythm that matched the beat faintly spilling from the speaker. Before we continue, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and tell us, where in the world are you watching from? For 3 years, they had ignored toys, ignored games, ignored the well-meaning attempts of specialists who tried to break their silence with clinical precision. Yet here, now, they were reacting as if the music had always been inside them, waiting for the right person to unlock it. The kitchen had transformed into something no therapy session had ever achieved. Cairo lifted his arms like an airplane, wobbling from side to side, while Ethan attempted to copy Naraya's swaying hips, his tiny body jerking out of sync, but full of fierce determination. She laughed with them, not at them, her joy feeding theirs in an endless loop. That's it, little warriors, she whispered, kneeling again, her forehead nearly touching Ethan's as she mirrored his stomp. He giggled louder this time, a pure sound that rang through her in a way that made her eyes sting with unshed tears. Cairo rushed to her other side, clapping in rhythm with the beat, and then all 3 of them were caught in the current of motion and laughter, spinning in a sacred circle of connection. She felt her chest tightening with something she hadn't expected to feel so quickly. Attachment, love, purpose. In only 3 weeks, she had been praying, searching, believing for the crack in their shell, the one spark that might connect them to the world. And now here it was, music, rhythm, movement, presence. It wasn't about hearing in the traditional sense. It was vibration, soul, connection. They could feel it, and so could she. For the first time since she had arrived in the Vaughn mansion, she believed these boys were not unreachable. They were simply waiting for the right rhythm to guide them out of their shadows. And then the door opened. It was in the middle of this impromptu dance, this holy moment, that Alaric Vaughn walked in. He had intended only to grab a file he had left on the counter earlier, his mind still spinning with projections and profit margins, when he stopped dead at the sight before him. The file slipped from his hand without him noticing. It hit the floor with a dull thud that no one heard, because Cairo and Ethan were not withdrawn, not staring blankly at walls as they usually did. They were moving, laughing. Ethan's head was thrown back in unrestrained joy, his hands still wrapped tightly around Naraya's fingers as though afraid to let go. Cairo stumbled into her side, clutching her arm for balance, but laughing all the same, his small body shaking with mirth. The sound, the sight hit Alaric with such force that his breath caught. His children were laughing. His sons, who had spent 3 years locked in silence, were dancing clumsily in the middle of his kitchen, their tiny feet stomping in time to a song he hadn't heard since his wife was alive. His chest ached with something violent, something long buried, hope. He wanted to move, to step into the room, to demand how this was happening, but his feet refused. All he could do was stand there, rooted in shock, watching the impossible unfold. He didn't even realize his hand had lifted to his chest until he felt his fingers press against the sharp ache spreading there. The scene before him blurred, for a moment, as if his mind couldn't process it. Naraya twirled once more, then bent low to look into Ethan's face, her smile radiant, her voice soft, though Alaric could not hear the words over the rush of his own heartbeat. Cairo clapped again, signing something rudimentary with his little hands, and Ethan followed suit, their eyes shining with joy. Alaric's throat tightened until it burned. He hadn't seen them like this, hadn't believed they could ever look like this. For the first time in years, there was life in their eyes, unfiltered, raw, overwhelming, and at the center of it all was Naraya, the woman he had barely noticed beyond her duties, now drawing out of his children something that no doctor, no therapist, no specialist had been able to. He felt dizzy with the realization that the silence which had smothered his house had been broken, not by him, but by her. Standing in the doorway, he could do nothing but stare, his chest heavy with shock, grief, and the flicker of a dangerous, long-forgotten hope. This was the beginning of everything. But Alaric didn't know that yet. All he knew was the terror rising in his throat, sharp and metallic, tasting like the moment he'd been told Seraphine wouldn't make it through the night. Hope, he had learned, was the cruelest thing a man could carry. It promised everything and delivered only ashes. He turned on his heel and left before anyone noticed him standing there. Over the next few days, Naraya felt the shift in the house like a change in atmospheric pressure. Alaric watched her now, not openly, not directly, but she caught his shadow lingering outside doorways, his footsteps pausing in hallways when she sang softly to herself while folding laundry. She didn't let it stop her. Every afternoon, when the boys finished their structured lessons with the speech therapist who came and went without ever truly reaching them, Naraya would bring them into the kitchen. She started small, always small. A soft clap, a rhythmic tap on the marble counter. She'd place their small hands flat against the surface while she drummed her fingers beside theirs, letting them feel the vibration travel through stone and skin. Come on, loves. Feel it. It's here. It's always been here. She never called it therapy. That word belonged to the cold, clinical world of doctors and progress charts. This was something else entirely. This was play. This was life. She'd hum while she worked, low and steady, letting her voice become another kind of vibration in the room. Sometimes she'd tap her foot on the tile floor in rhythm, then guide their bare feet to the same spot so they could feel the pulse traveling up through their legs. Cairo caught on first. He'd stomp his foot experimentally, then look up at her with wide, questioning eyes, as if asking, "Like this?" "Yes, baby, just like that." Ethan was quieter, more hesitant, but once he felt the rhythm under his skin, something unlocked in him. He'd press his whole body against the counter, his cheek flat against the cool stone, eyes closed, a small smile playing at his lips, and Nariah would whisper scripture over them while they moved. Faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. She'd murmur, her hands guiding theirs in gentle claps. "But you, Lord, you are not limited by ears. You speak to the soul." She believed it with a ferocity that surprised even her. She believed God heard her prayers. She believed he saw these boys, not as broken, but as whole in ways the world couldn't measure. And she believed deep in the marrow of her bones that healing didn't always look like what people expected. Sometimes it looked like joy. It happened on a Thursday afternoon, 3 days after Alaric had first seen them dancing. The house had been particularly quiet that morning, the kind of silence that felt heavy and expectant, like the air before a thunderstorm. Nariah had been preparing a snack in the kitchen, slicing apples into thin wedges when the boys wandered in. They didn't ask for anything. They simply stood there, barefoot on the cool tile, waiting. She looked down at them and felt that familiar nudge in her spirit. "You want to dance, don't you?" Cairo nodded eagerly. Ethan just smiled. Nariah glanced toward the hallway, half expecting to see Alaric's shadow there, but the house was still. So she reached for her speaker, turned the volume up just slightly higher than before, and let the music fill the room. This time, she didn't wait for them to respond. She lifted Ethan onto the counter first, his small feet finding balance on the smooth stone. Then Cairo, who scrambled up eagerly, his hands gripping the edge for stability. The music pulsed through the countertop, vibrating up through their legs, into their chests, their hearts. Nariah stood between them, clapping in rhythm, her whole body moving with a joy that felt almost reckless. "The Lord is my strength and my song," she declared over the music, her voice strong and sure. "He has become my salvation." The boys began to move, not carefully this time, but wildly, freely. Cairo threw his arms up like he was reaching for the sky, his laughter silent but visible in the way his whole face opened up. Ethan stomped his feet on the counter, the vibrations doubling, tripling, echoing through the kitchen like a drum. And then they were dancing. Not the hesitant, experimental movements from before, but something unleashed, something that had been locked away for 3 years, finally set free. Nariah laughed with them, her heart so full it ached. The house didn't feel cold anymore. The light streaming through the tall windows seemed warmer, softer, as if even the sun was leaning in to witness this moment. She spun between them, taking their hands, guiding them into spins and stomps and movements that had no name but felt holy anyway. "If God be for us," she whispered, then shouted, "Who can be against us?" The boys didn't hear the words, but they felt them. She saw it in their eyes, in the way they reached for her, in the way they moved without fear. This was forbidden joy, the kind that defied logic and grief and every carefully constructed rule that said life in this house had to be quiet, controlled, somber. But Nariah had never been good at following rules that contradicted the voice of God. She sensed the danger even as she danced, felt it like a cold draft cutting through the warmth. She knew Alaric wouldn't understand this, knew he would see it as recklessness, maybe even cruelty, to give his sons something they might lose again. But she also knew she couldn't stop. Not now. Not when she could see the life returning to their eyes. So she kept moving, kept clapping, kept declaring, and that's when Alaric walked in. He hadn't meant to come home early. A meeting had been canceled, a rare gap in his relentless schedule, and he'd driven back to the mansion on autopilot, his mind still tangled in spreadsheets and projections. But the moment he stepped through the side entrance near the kitchen, he heard it. Music. Not soft background noise, not the careful, therapeutic sounds the specialists had recommended, but loud, joyful, defiant music vibrating through the walls. His body moved before his mind could catch up, pulling him toward the kitchen. And then he froze. Time didn't just slow, it shattered. His sons were on the counter, barefoot, dancing, their small bodies moving in wild, uncoordinated joy. Cairo's mouth was open in laughter Alaric couldn't hear, but could see, could feel, radiating off him like heat. Ethan was stomping so hard the whole counter seemed to pulse with rhythm. And Naraya stood between them, her hands raised, her voice lifted in what sounded like prayer or song or both, her face glowing with something Alaric hadn't seen in another human being since Seraphine died. Faith. His first reaction was not joy. It was terror. Pure, visceral, bone-deep terror. Because this was hope. This was the possibility that things could be different, that his sons could be reached, that the walls he'd built to protect them, to protect himself, might not be necessary. And if he let himself believe that, if he let himself hope, and it was taken away again, he couldn't survive it. He knew that with absolute certainty. His hands trembled at his sides. His breath came shallow and fast. He wanted to shout, to demand what she thought she was doing, putting his children on a counter, filling their heads with impossible dreams. But he couldn't move, couldn't speak, because somewhere beneath the terror, beneath the grief and the rage and the fear, something else stirred, something that felt dangerously close to belief. Naraya turned then, as if sensing him there. Their eyes met across the kitchen. She didn't stop moving, didn't stop the music, didn't apologize with her gaze. Instead, she smiled at him, a small, knowing smile that said, "I see your fear, but watch anyway." And Alaric, frozen in the doorway, his entire world tilting on its axis, could do nothing but obey. The music stopped, not because Naraya turned it off, but because Alaric strode across the kitchen and yanked the speaker's cord from the wall with such force the entire unit clattered to the floor. The silence that followed was absolute. Cairo and Ethan froze on the counter, their small bodies going rigid, their eyes wide with confusion and sudden fear. Naraya's hands were still raised mid-clap, her smile fading as she turned fully to face him. "Get them down," Alaric said, his voice low and trembling with barely contained rage. "Now." She moved carefully, lifting Ethan first, then Cairo, setting them gently on the floor. The boys clung to her legs, peering up at their father with expressions Naraya had never seen them wear before. Not joy, not curiosity, fear. Alaric's jaw was clenched so tight she could see the muscle twitching beneath his skin. His hands were fisted at his sides, knuckles white. When he finally spoke again, his words came out like shards of glass. "What do you think you're doing?" Naraya straightened, placing herself between him and the boys. Her voice, when it came, was steady. "I was playing with them, sir." "Playing?" His laugh was bitter, hollow. "You were filling their heads with false hope. You were making them believe in something that doesn't exist." "They were happy," she said simply. "For how long?" he shot back, taking a step closer. "For an hour? A day? And then what happens when reality crashes back in? When they realize that no amount of dancing or music or whatever this is will change what they are?" The words hung in the air, like poison. Naraya felt her chest tighten, but she kept her voice calm, gentle even. "They're not broken, Mr. Vaughn. They're just different. Don't, he said, his voice cracking. Don't stand there and tell me about my own sons. I've spent 3 years, taking them to every specialist, every doctor, every expert in the world. Do you know what they all said? They said there's no cure, no fix, no miracle coming. He was breathing hard now, his composure unraveling. And now you waltz in here with your music and your smiles and your what? Your faith? You think that's going to change anything? You think God cares about two deaf boys in a mansion? The question landed like a slap, but Nariah didn't flinch. Yes, she said quietly. I do. Alaric stared at her, his eyes red-rimmed, his expression a mixture of rage and something far more vulnerable. You're disrespecting her memory, he whispered, and for the first time, his voice broke completely. My wife believed in prayer. She believed in God. She prayed every single day of her pregnancy. And you know what happened? She died. She died, and they were born like this, and no amount of faith changed any of it. The room seemed to hold its breath. Nariah met his gaze, her own eyes shining with unshed tears, but her voice remained steady. Sir, I don't heal. God does. And I don't know why your wife was taken. I don't know why your sons were born deaf, but I do know that God hasn't abandoned them. Or you. Alaric turned away sharply, his shoulders shaking. Get out, he said. Nariah blinked. Sir? Get out of this kitchen. Go to your quarters. He ran a hand through his hair, his whole body trembling. I'll decide what to do with you tomorrow. Nariah looked down at Cairo and Ethan, who were still pressed against her legs, their small faces tilted up toward her in silent confusion. She crouched down, took each of their hands, and squeezed gently. Then she rose and walked out without another word. The house returned to silence. But it was not the same silence as before. This silence was heavier, thicker, like something living and wounded. The twins felt it immediately. They wandered the hallways the next morning, their hands trailing along walls, their eyes searching doorways as if looking for someone who'd vanished. Cairo kept tapping his foot on the tile in the kitchen, the same rhythm Nariah had taught him. When no vibration answered back, he'd stop, furrow his brow, and try again. And again. Ethan stood in front of the counter where they danced, his small hands pressed flat against the stone, waiting. When nothing happened, he'd turn toward the doorway, his expression crumpling. Alaric watched from a distance, his chest tight with guilt and anger, and something he refused to name. He told himself he'd done the right thing, that he was protecting them, that Nariah had overstepped, had played with forces she didn't understand. But at night, alone in his study, he couldn't shake the image of his sons laughing. It happened 3 days later. Alaric was in the sunroom, reviewing contracts on his tablet, when Ethan wandered in. The boy stood at the far end of the room, staring out the window, his posture slumped in a way that made him look far older than 3. Alaric glanced up, then back down at his screen. Ethan, he said absently, not expecting anything. And Ethan turned. Not slowly, not hesitantly. He turned his head immediately, his eyes locking onto his father's. Alaric's tablet slipped from his hands. No, he whispered. No, that's not. He stood abruptly, his heart hammering. Ethan, he said again, louder this time. And again the boy turned, looked directly at him. Alaric's legs nearly gave out. He sank back into the chair, his hands shaking violently. It wasn't possible. Ethan was profoundly deaf. The audiologist had been certain. Multiple tests, multiple confirmations. This couldn't be happening. But when he said his son's name a third time, Ethan smiled and took a step toward him. The appointment with Dr. Reyes was scheduled for the next morning. Alaric barely slept. He ran through every rational explanation: coincidence, visual cues, unconscious patterns, but none of them fit. None of them explained the way Ethan had responded, immediate and certain, as if he'd heard his name spoken. Dr. Reyes conducted a full audiological exam, her expression growing more puzzled with each test. Finally, she removed her glasses and looked at Alaric with something close to disbelief. "Mr. Vaughn, I don't know how to explain this. 3 months ago, Ethan showed no response to sound at any frequency. Today, he's responding to moderate levels of auditory input. It's not full hearing, not yet, but it's significant improvement." Alaric stared at her. "That's impossible." "I'm aware," she said slowly, "but the data doesn't lie." "What about Cairo?" She glanced at her notes. "Cairo is showing similar, though slightly less pronounced changes. I'd like to run more tests, but Mr. Vaughn, something has shifted. I can't explain it medically." Alaric left the clinic in a daze. That night he sat alone in his study, a glass of whiskey untouched on the desk beside him. His mind kept circling back to Seraphine. She had believed, even when the pregnancy grew complicated, even when the doctors warned her of the risks, she had knelt beside their bed every night and prayed. "I know you see them," she'd whispered, her hands resting on her swollen belly. "I know you have a plan." And in the end, Alaric had watched her die believing it. He'd stood at her bedside, holding her hand as her breathing grew shallow, and she'd looked up at him with tears streaming down her face. "Promise me you'll let them know, God," she'd said. "Promise me you won't let grief steal that from them." He had promised, and then he'd spent 3 years breaking that promise. Now, sitting in the dark, Alaric felt something inside him crack. Not break, not yet, but crack, wide enough to let a sliver of light through, wide enough to let a question rise that he'd spent years silencing. What if she was right? The morning Alaric heard his son's voice for the first time, he wasn't prepared for it. He'd spent the past week in a fog of confusion and reluctant wonder, watching Cairo and Ethan respond to sounds they shouldn't have been able to hear. Every rational part of him insisted there had to be an explanation, a medical anomaly, something science could eventually name and categorize. But science had no answers, only questions. He was in his office when it happened, reviewing quarterly reports that blurred together on the screen. The house was quiet, as it always was, or at least as it had been for 3 years. Then he heard it, soft, uncertain, but unmistakable. Dada. The word floated up from the first floor, carried on a voice he'd only ever imagined in dreams. Alaric's world stopped. The pen in his hand clattered to the desk. His chair scraped backward as he stood, his legs unsteady, his breath caught somewhere between his lungs and his throat. "Dada," the voice came again, slightly louder, more insistent. He moved without thinking, his body taking over where his mind had stalled. Down the hallway, down the stairs, his hand gripping the banister so hard his knuckles went white. And there, at the bottom of the staircase, stood Ethan, his small face tilted upward, his mouth forming the word again. Dada. Alaric's knees buckled. He didn't fall so much as surrender, sinking onto the bottom step, his hands reaching for his son with a desperation that shattered every wall he'd spent years constructing. Ethan walked into his arms, and Alaric pulled him close, buried his face in his son's hair, and broke. Not as a billionaire, not as a man who'd built empires and controlled boardrooms, but as a father who'd been drowning in grief and had just been thrown a lifeline. "Ethan," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Ethan, my son." Cairo appeared in the doorway to the kitchen, his eyes wide with something that looked like hope. He took a tentative step forward, then another, and Alaric opened his other arm. "Cairo," he breathed, "come here." And when both boys were in his embrace, When he could feel their small hearts beating against his chest, Alaric wept like he hadn't wept since the night Seraphine died. But these were different tears. These were tears of something he'd forgotten existed. Life. He found Nariah in her quarters that afternoon. She was folding laundry, her movements slow and methodical, her face calm, but her eyes carrying the weight of someone who'd been exiled for doing what she believed was right. When she looked up and saw him standing in the doorway, she didn't speak, simply waited. Alaric cleared his throat. His pride, his anger, his carefully constructed armor, all of it felt ridiculous now in the face of what had happened. I need to... He stopped, started again. I'm sorry. Nariah set down the towel in her hands. Sir, you don't have to... Yes, I do. He stepped into the room, and for the first time since she'd arrived, he looked at her. Really looked at her. I was wrong. About everything. She held his gaze, her expression gentle but unwavering. Ethan spoke today, Alaric continued, his voice thick. He said my name. And I... He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture revealing his exhaustion, his surrender. I don't understand how this is happening. The doctors can't explain it, but I know it started with you. Not me, Nariah said quietly. God. Alaric nodded slowly, the admission costing him something, but also freeing something. I need you to come back. To the kitchen. To them. He paused. Please? Nariah smiled then, the kind of smile that carried both forgiveness and knowing. I never left them, Mr. Vaughn. I've been praying for them every night. I know, he whispered, and I think he swallowed hard. I think God heard you. That evening, Alaric walked into the kitchen where Nariah stood with the twins. She'd set up the speaker again, music already humming through the room. Cairo and Ethan were barefoot, their small hands pressed against the counter, waiting. When they saw their father, they smiled. Alaric stopped just inside the doorway, the same spot where he'd stood frozen weeks ago. But this time, he didn't retreat. Can I join you? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Nariah's eyes shone. Of course. He crossed the kitchen slowly, as if approaching something sacred. When he reached the counter, he placed his hands flat against the cool stone, just as his sons had done. Feel it? Nariah asked gently, turning up the music slightly. The vibration traveled through the marble, up through his palms, into his arms. It was subtle, but undeniable, a pulse that matched the rhythm of the song. Alaric nodded, not trusting his voice. Nariah lifted. Ethan onto the counter first, then Cairo. The boys began to move, their bodies remembering the joy they'd discovered, and this time their father stood with them. Nariah began to clap, her movements drawing them in, creating a circle of motion and connection. Then she closed her eyes and began to pray. Not silently, not hidden, out loud. Lord, you are the God who heals. You are the God who restores what grief has stolen. You are the God who speaks to souls when ears cannot hear. Thank you for these boys. Thank you for this Father. Thank you for showing us that your miracles don't need our permission, only our surrender. Alaric felt his throat tighten. The words washed over him like water over parched ground, filling cracks he hadn't known existed. The twins danced, their laughter, both silent and spoken now, filling the space, and Nariah kept praying, kept moving, kept declaring truth over them. And then Alaric did something he hadn't done in 3 years. He knelt, right there in the kitchen, his hands still pressed against the counter. He lowered himself to his knees. God, he whispered, the word feeling foreign and familiar all at once. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to believe again. But if you're there, if you're listening, he stopped, his voice breaking. Thank you. Thank you for not giving up on them, on us. When he looked up, Neriah was crying, but she was smiling too, her hands still moving in rhythm, her faith unshaken. She wasn't the maid anymore. She was family. The mansion changed after that night. Music became a constant presence, flowing through rooms that had been silent for too long. Laughter echoed down hallways, the twins' voices growing stronger each day, speaking words that had once seemed impossible. Alaric learned to dance. Awkwardly at first, his movements stiff and uncertain, but his sons didn't care. They grabbed his hands and pulled him into their joy, teaching him what Neriah had taught them, that healing doesn't always look like perfection. Sometimes it looks like rhythm, like presence, like love. The doctors continued their tests, continued their confusion. But Alaric stopped needing their explanations. He understood now what Seraphine had known all along, that God doesn't heal according to human timelines or medical logic, that faith reaches where sound cannot, that miracles grow quietly before they roar. One evening, as Alaric stood in the doorway of the twins' room, watching Neriah tuck them in, singing a lullaby they could now partially hear, he felt the final piece of his broken heart click into place. God had never left his house. He'd been waiting, patient and persistent, at the door Alaric had locked from the inside. And when Alaric finally opened it, when he finally surrendered his grief and his control and his fear, God walked in and filled every corner with light. The silence had learned to speak, and the frozen had learned to dance. And a father who'd believed hope was cruel discovered it was the kindest gift he'd ever been given. Because joy, he realized, wasn't rebellion against his wife's memory. It was the fulfillment of her final prayer.